Racing games have brought us all massive joy. Well, most of the time. You all know what I mean when I say some racing titles have kept well under their expectations in recent years. From botched takeovers to helpless revivals, here are the 5 most disappointing racing games. And with that, welcome back to Overtake. Every once in a while, people get hyped for a change. Like when a new engine gets announced for an upcoming title or a concept gets an overhaul. What usually doesn't fill fans with excitement is an EA takeover. For the many years EA has used to completely tank their reputation in the online community, that is an understandable reaction. It's also reasonable that when people heard about the merge of EA and Codemasters, the excitement for a 5th place, F122, was turned into kind of a suspense waiting game. Would they do it? Would you finally be getting FIFA in F122? But who would have guessed? Even this very timid stance of the community was turned into disappointment with F122. In Germany, there is the phrase Verschlimmbesserung. It basically means to have something changed with the intention of making it better, but ending up making it worse. This pretty much summarizes F122. We have talked at length about the beautiful edition of F1 Live and the supercars. I bet the thinking behind them was good, but the result is just lackluster. Just like the game in general, to be honest. If you carefully peek into the player numbers, you can see that the F1 Manager nearly doubles the numbers of F122 on Steam, even only months after the release of the latter. Of course, a lot of reasons play into factor why F1 Manager is surging right now. But this discrepancy should never exist, as well as the discrepancy between you and the mouse. To hit the like button, subscribe and tap the bell. So whenever we discuss something like this, you get notified. But back to the top list. F122 has simply not brought upon the changes that were necessary after such a gigantic takeover, and thus disappointed many former fans of the series. Not a very good first look at F1 EA. Staying on topic, here is another classic for you. Also EA, but a different era. We used to have the best games, I swear. And publishers know this as well. That's why they cater to it as much as they can. Especially with games like our 4th place, Need for Speed 2015. Trailer, announcement, legit everything surrounding this title was pointing in a vintage direction. Finally, a title just like the Undergrounds, Most Wanteds and Carbons of the past. With exciting racing, cop chases and illegal tuning galore. Until you woke up from your fever dream. The reality looked more like the worst low-budget action movie you have ever watched. Scenes filmed in real life with the most non-believable characters ever made. Playing this is a chore every start. The atmosphere was so far removed from illegal street racing and cool, Ned Flanders could have played it to perfection. But on the other hand, the game constantly told us to pick up the phone at 150 km/h. And for what? Only for the soulless characters to endlessly LARP at our ear.
Just playing, man.
I mean, where's the flight mode in this thing, for God's sake? And oh yeah, the main aspect of the game wasn't even mentioned yet. If we are honest, back in the days, driving physics weren't on the same level of importance as they are today. But now that we know what is capable, even for 2015 standards, this game was well behind everything car-related. Labored and slow movements made some cars feel like a hot tub on wheels, while drifting seemed like they ripped it straight from Holidays on Ice. At least with this they stuck to the roots and copied the physics straight from the PS2 version of Need for Speed Carbon, it seemed like. Needless to say, fans of the genre weren't exactly ecstatic after the release. While it was more of a 20-hour advert for Monster Energy, there could have been the opportunity to give players what they wanted, even if that meant taking a step back in some regards. What is the old saying? Oh yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But instead, they torched the damn thing. Need for Speed 2015 is just another try to rekindle the past, giving fans false hope only to have it crushed on release by new age, stone age driving physics and terrible acting. Still better than ruining the hopes of the fan base that waited multiple years for a good release. The third biggest disappointment in racing game history in our eyes has to be NASCAR Ignition from 2021. The game itself has nothing that hasn't been said yet. It is tough on the eyes, tough on the nerves, and tough on your hands because of the unexisting wheel support. But instead of this being the lone standout in a series of good NASCAR games, it is legitimately the opposite. You see, prior to the release of NASCAR Ignition, the series was called NASCAR Heat, which was an uneventful semi-annual release which kept implementing minor improvements. But then motorsport games took over, or rather 704 games tagged out, and the rest has been well documented even on our channel. What followed is quite possibly the worst execution of a racing title in recent memory. MSG served the players an unfinished product with more bugs than the Amazon. The backlash it had from critics and fans alike was something else to see. But what mainly kickstarted the frustration for many is the unrealistic teasing of Ignition compared to the product they delivered in the end. Similar to others on this list, the devs didn't hold back on promising a new form of NASCAR experience. If you add to all of this that the prior NASCAR games were bottom of the totem pole as well, you get why the fan base could be a tad bit annoyed. They were willing to give the NASCAR Heat series the benefit of the doubt because very early on it was announced that NASCAR Ignition was in production. What ended up happening was years of false hopes accumulating in the biggest anticlimax possible. A bad, underdeveloped, and quite possibly unfixable title. You can't help but wonder where all this developing time went into. Speaking of long developing times, our second place has to be the nicest way to be disappointed in something, if you could say so. GT7 has its advantages, undoubtedly. Insane detail graphically, many returning features, and an array of cool things to do. But does it feel like it lived up to nearly 7 years of development it went through? No, definitely not. A little over 2 months ago, I talked about a number of problems the GT7 community shares on the regular, on forums and other platforms online. Many, if not all, come down to one thing: the expectation of something massive and the resulting disappointment. In retrospective, I feel the same way. GT7 underwhelmed in most departments. When fans hoped for an enticing, self-driven story, they got the cafe tour. When fans wanted a game centered around affordable cars with a lot of history, they got microtransactions at the legacy dealership for cars that cost 1 trillion credits to add. And when players asked for complete online competition, they got a kerfluffle of incoherent races and a flawed multiplayer. After centuries of producing some of the most captivating racing games known to us, Polyphony and Sony simply aren't held to the same standards as others on this list. Yes, I'm looking at you over there. That's exactly why I feel the disappointment with GT7 is higher than with nearly any other racing game in recent time. It's formidable, but after 7 years of development, hitting minimum isn't satisfactory. But at least GT7 didn't betray their player base completely, unlike our number 1 spot. Please take a look at the stage of dirt when we introduced the straight up worst example of disappointing racing game. Project Cars 3 is such a willing target to harp on again, just like we talked about in our legendary video Why I Was Wrong About Project Cars 3. The game disappointed close to anyone who has ever touched it. The franchise made the jump from a serious contender of simcade supremacy in PC2 to an accumulation of awful choices, like the removal of tire wear, pit stops, and fuel usage. Instead, they added anything that would make you feel like playing a mobile game, or the imagination of somebody who didn't like racing games in the first place. I would tend to bet That both was not true for Slightly Mad Studios at the time. So it made it all the bit weirder when Project Cars 3 ended up this way. This game, by the way, is a good example of having mixed reviews, but actually getting called trash by every bona fide player it had. And it wasn't like the expectations weren't set immensely high at the time. Pre-release, Project Cars 3 was called the most realistic simulator yet by the developers. Yeah, no pressure here. It ended up not even being a driving simulator at all, really. That's the funny part. In terms of disappointment, I can't think of any way to let your fanbase down even more. I mean, the fans crowdfunded the original game, kept funding the second one, and by the time the third one came out, Slightly Mad dipped and got bought out by EA. In some countries of the world, that would be grounds for treason. But at least everything comes full circle with the buyout from EA. There won't be any expectations to disappoint now for the next iteration of Project Cars. Did we miss any of the biggest disappointments? Tell us in the comments below. That's it from my side, and until next time, cheerio.